Welcome to this Brodie's 10-minute take on safety at work. I'm Carly Forrest, a solicitor in our insurance and risk team, and I'm here today with my colleague Kate Donachie. And this podcast is part of a continuing focus which we have been doing on COVID claims. And today we are asking the question, what does safe mean? It's a word we've been hearing quite a lot at the moment, isn't it, Kate?
Yes, it is. And today we're talking about safe in relation to people getting back to work.
And that's whether it's safe to go back to employment.
And also whether or not work practices and systems are safe when people are back.
Yeah, because I think it's fair to say that lots of people at the moment are scared that it's not safe to go back to work. Perhaps that's understandable in light of the statistics which we're hearing on a daily basis, and obviously the lockdown measures that have been in place.
Yeah, I think that's right. We know that COVID-19 hasn't gone away. We also, so far as we can know that most people in the UK haven't had the virus, and so they're therefore vulnerable to catching it. People, I think, are fearful that returning to work puts them at risk of catching COVID-19 and becoming ill.
But I think the flip side of that is that we can't wait until the virus has been completely extinguished or we have a vaccine, can we? I mean, it looks as though that could potentially be a year, maybe more away. And it's obviously important to consider the economy and to try to look at all of this in some sort of context.
Yeah, I think there is a consensus that we need to get back to some kind of normality. Life can't remain on hold until the virus is gone or has been entirely controlled.
So what do we mean then by saying, is it safe to return or is it safe at work?
Well, we know that an employer is not under a duty to make everything zero risk. An employer's duty remains the same, which is set out in the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 to ensure the health, safety and welfare of employees and those affected by the operation so far as is reasonably practicable.
So we're still looking at the same process in terms of risk assessment to determine the risk something poses, and then looking at what can be done to reduce that risk to the lowest level reasonably practicable.
Yep. And I think it's worthwhile thinking about how we assess risk in this context. First, we need to quantify the risk.
And there's obviously two considerations with that. So there's the gravity of the consequences if the risk comes to pass, and then also the likelihood of it occurring.
Yep, which is particularly relevant here, given the potential severity of the virus.
But we also know that the likelihood of that happening varies significantly depending on a person's specific characteristics.
Yes. So there are some people for whom the gravest of consequences are incredibly unlikely, and others for whom they are much more likely to happen.
So in terms of quantifying the risk, then it's important to be clear about the difference across different characteristics.
Absolutely, because when you come to look at the control measures, that difference could have a key impact.
And once we've worked out the magnitude of the risk, we then have to think about what can be done to control that risk.
Yes, and it's here that the control measures need to recognise the different levels of risk which are faced by different employees.
And when you say that, do you mean that employers need to identify those who are particularly vulnerable to the virus and then apply different rules to them?
Possibly, yes. Obviously, if the operation in fact poses very low risk of infection because everyone can work from home, for example, then there would be no need for differentiation. But where the nature of the work gives rise to risk of infection, then what's safe for one person might not be safe for someone else.
And just to be clear here, by safe, we're not saying that there is no risk of infection or even that there's no risk of serious illness. We're talking about the level of risk being at an acceptable level. I think that's an important point.
Yeah, I agree. There's no duty on an employer to ensure that its employees are exposed to absolutely no risk whatsoever. The duty is to do all that's reasonably practicable to reduce that risk.
So therefore, safe doesn't mean entirely risk-free.
No, it doesn't. And I think that's getting lost sometimes.
And I mean, there are more general control measures here, and which we probably are all aware of, such as reducing the numbers of staff in any one area, or achieving social distancing, physical distancing between workers, and providing good hand washing and good hygiene facilities.
Yeah, clearly there will be a risk of infection at work, and regardless of the worker's characteristics, this risk should be reduced to the lowest level possible.
And once you know how low that risk can be brought, so both by excluding certain groups of people and by introducing the social distancing and hygiene measures, you have to weigh the remaining risk against the benefit the activity would bring.
That's right. And here we see a difference between the amount of risk which is acceptable for a core function of the business, so say the operation of a production line in a factory, and something which doesn't bring about a substantive benefit or isn't essential. So for example, there, the staff canteen.
And the benefit derived from the activity is therefore going to have a bearing on whether or not the risk is acceptable or not.
Yes, because you could decide that the risk of something happening isn't in fact outweighed by the benefit of the activity that creates the risk.
Mm-hmm. And I think here, I suppose we also see that the word safe doesn't actually have a constant meaning, because the same amount of risk might be acceptable for some activities, but not necessarily for others.
Yeah, it's really not an absolute term.
And it's probably worth pausing here, because I think as a result of lots of press and social media content, there does seem to be a bit of a conflation between safe and zero risk of infection. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there seems to be a tendency to argue that something isn't safe because the risk of infection hasn't been entirely removed, or that there can be no guarantee that there is no risk of infection. And I don't think it's helpful in the context of people getting back to work.
No, I don't think it is, because of course, I think what we have to bear in mind, and again, trying to put it into context, we deal with risk in our day-to-day lives. So, for example, we know that getting in a car, to take an obvious example, creates a risk of being in an accident, but generally we decide that the risk is sufficiently low and sufficiently outweighed by the benefit of wherever we need to get to travelling by car to make it acceptable.
And at work too, there'll always be risks to us at work. It would be impossible to create a risk-free environment.
But we accept those risks because they're sufficiently low, and also they're necessary to bring about a worthwhile benefit.
Yeah, I think though it is also important to remember that just because a risk can't be entirely excluded, it isn't acceptable to leave it unabated. An employer can't entirely remove the risk of infection, but the likelihood of it happening and the gravity of the harm it's likely to cause if it does can be reduced significantly here by controlling who's in the workplace and how they work when they are there.
Yeah, and I think we've discussed before, Kate, how crucial it is for employers to bring their employees with them in terms of the back to work process. So in terms of communicating with them to reassure employees that they will be safe. And I think also communicating to employees that safe doesn't require zero risk. I think that's an important first step in the process.
Absolutely. Otherwise, every proposed control measure will be viewed as inadequate unless it does achieve zero risk of infection, which is impossible. If employers can have this discussion with employees and allow them to understand that they can be safe, even where there's some risk, then I think that would be very helpful in allowing people to feel comfortable and happy about coming back to work.
Mm-hmm. So I suppose, to go back to our question about what does safe mean, well, it's perhaps not entirely satisfactory, but the answer is lots of things depending on the circumstances.
Yeah, I think that's right. But understanding that's the case is a really important first step in reassuring people about the safety of returning to work.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of, I mean, obviously it is an evolving area at the moment, so we are providing a lot of advice to our clients and contacts on this. So we will be doing more articles and